Worried. But we start this morning with this fight over voting rights. It is the focus of President Biden's speech in Philadelphia today and the focus of a last-ditch effort by Texas Democrats who officially fled their home state late yesterday to keep state Republicans from having enough lawmakers to pass new voting rules. I've got a great group here to break all of this down. Michael Memoli, he's in Philadelphia with the president. Priscilla Thompson in Austin, Texas. Latasha Brown, the co-founder of the group Black Voters Matter. And Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. She's an assistant dean at the University of Texas. Priscilla, walk us through this. The Texas state Democrats are now in D.C. What happens? Does this actually change anything or just delay the process?
Right, Steph. This is the Texas Democrats' first full day back on the ground in Washington, D.C. We know at the top of the next hour they're going to be kicking things off with a press conference where they're going to again call for federal legislation and action on voting. But as for what happens here in Texas, the Texas House is going to convene in the next few hours. We expect that the Speaker of the House will go ahead and set the wheels in motion, begin the process for giving law enforcement permission to track down these Texas lawmakers who have fled. But of course, Texas law enforcement will have no jurisdiction in Washington, D.C. unless officials there choose to give them permission to go in and get those lawmakers. And so Texas Governor Greg Abbott is already thinking through what his next steps are going to be to get his agenda passed. Take a listen to what he said on Fox News last night.
I can and I will continue to call special session after special session after special session all the way up until election next year. And so if these people want to be hanging out wherever they're hanging out on this taxpayer paid junket, they're going to have to be prepared to do it for well over a year. As soon as they come back in the state of Texas, they will be arrested. They will be cabined inside the Texas Capitol until they get their job done.
And he actually said that in a local interview here in Austin. But until either of those things happen, either another special session is called or Texas Democrats return during this session, which they have signaled they do not intend to do, the House here is effectively at a standstill and not able to get any work done. Steph?
Not able to get any work done. Latasha, this is a taxpayer-paid trip. You've got the governor now threatening their arrest. I know you support this move, but I want to get practical. If Republicans walked out of a state house because they did not want to pass a bill in a state where Democrats were in charge, would you feel the same?
You know, it depends on if it was a bill. If it was a bill about voting rights, absolutely. I think that this is an issue that should be a nonpartisan issue. Matter of fact, I think that there's some Republicans that should have gone with the Democrats. The bottom line is I don't see voting rights as a partisan issue. I see this as a democracy issue. There is an existential crisis around democratic participation. We judge the health of democracy based on access. So this is a suppression session. Let's be honest about what this is. This is political theater and a platform for the governor who is running for office next year. You know, in a state that just in February, he had a major issue around the grid, where people still in his state right now do not have access to be able to use their air conditioning. They're actually telling people to ration out because they have not fixed the energy issue, but would call a special session, which we call a suppression session, to literally leave because he lost his ego. He lost and could not pull the voter suppression bill. So, yes, this is a session that we have to really get beyond the politics. This isn't just about partisanship. This is really fundamentally about democracy.
Vicky, take me to Texas. Did Texans think it's political theater on the part of the governor or these Democratic lawmakers that are in D.C.? Because I found it fascinating. The Republicans keep saying this is a very un-Texas move to run away from a fight. Explain to me what's going on in Texas.
Right. So a lot of this is going to depend on what letter you have by your name, how you look at this, whether it's good for democracy or whether they're running away. But I think one thing that is important to contextualize, Stephanie, is that in the lead up to this special session, we knew we were going to have a special section dealing with voting rights. The Speaker of the House and other leadership had made gestures that they were going to be more open to negotiation. They were going to be more conciliatory, backtracking on some of the animosity we saw during the regular session. We went into this weekend with hours and hours of testimony. So there was this like mini glimmer of hope that there was going to be a democratic process where both R's and D's came together to hash out what was best for the state. But what happened after the hours of public testimony is the committees they voted, they fast-tracked these bills, and they took them to the point where they could be voted on this week. At that point, the Democrats said, okay, wait a minute. Where was this glimmer that we're going to be able to negotiate, to offer amendments, to discuss what is going on? And that's where the Democrats said, we have no other option because the door to democratic process negotiation has been shut. So I think that's important to contextualize why Democrats did what they
Vicky,
did.
You just loaded us up with all of the facts and the context that matters. But unfortunately, most people never get to see that. From the perspective of the people from the state of Texas, does the governor end up winning a PR war here, even if he doesn't deserve it? The people never get to really hear about that glimmer of hope or the bait and switch.
I know. And I was doing the boring, nerdy professor on you, Stephanie. But basically, this is what it boils down to. It boils down to the short term versus the long term. Look, in the short term, the governor and the Republican Party have the number, right? So he keep calling back sessions and ultimately some sort of voting restriction is going to get passed. But I think in the long term, what's interesting here is seeing how Democrats have gained in numbers. 10 years ago, Steph, they didn't even have enough Democrats to matter if they all walked out. Republicans had a supermajority. Over the last decade, slowly but surely, Democrats have gained enough seats to stage this fight. They might lose this battle ultimately, but I think it's this long-term trend that's interesting, even though in the short term, Abbott and the Republicans will probably get what they want.
I just want to point out, I love the nerdy professorial content. Mike, I want to talk about the president's speech in Philly. He is going to say we're just getting started trying to pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But what does that actually mean? This thing feels, either of them feel a million miles away from getting through Congress.
Yeah, Steph, it's going to be important for the president to come and use this opportunity to support those two key pieces of legislation working their way through Congress right now. But we know the math of the Senate, Steph. You need 60 votes in order to get anything done. And right now, the Democrats barely have the 50 votes that they need just to get a simple majority. And that's why some of the pressure that this White House is facing, both from progressive activists, but even some of the president's closest political allies, is for him to take this even a step further, to support abolishing the filibuster, or at least carving out an exception for important voting rights legislation like this. It's not clear that the president's going to go that far today in his remarks, but this is a speech, according to White House officials I've been speaking to, that is not necessarily directed at the activists on both sides of this debate who have been very much engaged in this issue. It's at the majority of the country who really hasn't been focused on it day to day. This is an opportunity for the president to come to Philadelphia, a city obviously rich with historical significance, political significance to this president, and really shine a spotlight on this issue. He's not going to mince words. I'm told he's going to call the kinds of Republican voting law changes unpatriotic, un-American, undemocratic. He's really going to link some of these voter suppression efforts that he sees to what we've seen throughout our history, Jim Crow laws, the intimidation tactics by the KKK, powerful words. This also is something that the White House sees a long game playing as well. This is an issue that they think should be front and center in the midterm elections. But Jim Clyburn, no less important ally of this White House than Jim Clyburn, he says pushing this to an election issue is going to not really mean anything if we lose a Senate seat like Raphael Warnock's in Georgia, like seats they must win in North Carolina and Florida. He wants to see the president come out stronger and for abolishing the filibuster, Steph.
Powerful words, but let's talk about what's going to happen in the short term, Latasha. Barring something totally unforeseen, these laws in Texas are going to pass. The federal voting rights bills are probably not going to, at least not in the short term. So do these Texas Democrats need to get themselves back to Texas and knock on every possible door to tell every Texan, this is what's happening to our voting rights, and you better get out there next election and vote?
I think it's going to be a couple of strategies. I think the fact that they're in D.C. actually helps the movement. That fundamentally, this isn't an issue just about Texas. Also, we've been fighting this in Georgia. We're fighting this all over this country right now. This is a national issue. And so while we're seeing what is happening in Texas, and yes, there's an election that is coming up next year, what we know is we need to have people who have integrity that literally will fight for the right to vote. It is a concentrated, concerted effort to literally be able to undermine voting rights of brown and black voters in this nation. Let's not forget that at one point, slavery was legal in this country. At one point, Jim Crow laws were legal in this country. That didn't make it right. And so fundamentally, while they may be able to pass this, that does not mean that people are not going to literally hold them accountable. That doesn't mean that organizations, we will continue to organize, we will be resilient, and we will be resistant. But also, I do think to see this kind of leadership from the Texas Dems to really heighten and bring up how important this issue is at this moment in time, I think that is going to help all of us in the long term.
All right, Latasha, Victoria, Michael, Priscilla, thank you all so much.